welcome to the fourth episode of GeoSpace. I'm Mohammed Salih, your host. Really glad you are joining us today. GeoSpace is the New Regions bi-weekly live series here on X, where we dive into the ever-shifting landscape of Middle Eastern geopolitics. We take a close look at power struggles, regional rivalries, and the broader strategies of global actors like the US, Russia, China, Europe, and others, all through the lens of real time developments and long term trends shaping the region. Today, I'm really thrilled to be joined by one of the leading voices on Iraqi politics, Sajad Jiyad. Sajad is a fellow and director of the Shia Politics Working Group at Century International. He has been closely tracking Iraq's internal and external dynamics for years and brings a wealth of insight to the conversation. We'll be unpacking Iraq's foreign policy today, how it has evolved over the past couple of decades and where it might be headed, especially in light of the major regional shakeups since October 7th, 2003, when Hamas launched its attacks on Israeli settlements and the Gaza war that subsequently erupted and reshaped regional alignments. Quick note before we jump in, we'll go for about an hour, roughly 45 to 50 minutes of discussion. Then we will open it up for your questions. You can send those in as replies to this post or request the mic at the end. And don't worry if you miss part of this episode. Each episode becomes a podcast that you can catch on the New Regions website under the watch section, as well as on the New Regions YouTube and SoundCloud channels by the next day. Thanks again for tuning in. Sajad, welcome to GeoSpace. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Mohammed, and good to be with you.
Thank you. So let me start with a foundational question. I think for the people who have been observing Iraq's foreign policy over the past couple of decades or so, a really fundamental question is, do we have something that can be clearly defined as Iraqi foreign policy? And the does or do Iraq's federal institutions actually articulate and pursue a coherent vision of the country's role and direction in the region and beyond? Or is it like more fragmented with no real unifying strategy behind it?
Thanks, Mohammed. That's a great question. I think it depends on how you look at Iraq from an external perspective. Do you see a unified government? Do you see one pole of power, or maybe two, or do you see multipolar powers in Iraq's government? I think the obvious answer to that is Iraq does not have a unified government. And when you have coalition governments with multiple poles of power, you can expect to have difficulty forming a policy that's coherent and that is agreed upon. So that's the first issue. The second is, who are the decision makers in policy making? As you know, in most democratic countries, the party that wins the elections and gets the right to form a government, even if they ally with one or two other coalition partners, they still have a fairly coherent foreign policy because the decision makers are limited. It's usually a prime minister or a president, including the foreign minister and maybe one of the key coalition allies. In Iraq's policy making, the decision makers are many. And unfortunately, that means that policy making becomes very difficult. And so we see that rarely is there agreement on any aspect of foreign policy. I think the one that's come across clearly these last few years is Iraq's wish to have some sort of neutrality in the region. It wants to be friends, for example, with Iran and the US at the same time. It wants to maintain good relations with as many countries as possible, avoiding joining any one side or axis and so on. I think that's probably the only defining feature of Iraq's foreign policy right now that we can see. But as long as we have these, divisions, political divisions that extend beyond 10, 12 parties, it makes it very difficult to have one coherent foreign policy.
Right. In terms of that desire for Iraq to have good relations with the neighbors, I understand that at the level of the federal government and the foreign ministry, that has been definitely the case, and especially over the past several years or so, since the premiership of Adel Abdul Mahdi, Kadhimi, and with Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani right now, that has been, that desire has been articulated in very clear and strong terms, as we have seen. But is this desire really shared by other groups inside Iraq? And in this case, I'm particularly, referring to the armed factions, those which have, close relations with Iran. Is this desire for Iraq to have a stable and friendly relations with its neighborhood shared among every, actor that is relevant and that has some sort of influence on Iraq's domestic and regional policies?
So I think broadly there are obviously three positions on this issue. There's one side that wants Iraq to have better relations, for example, with the United States, even at the cost of worse relations with Iran. But that's a minority position. And on the opposite side, it's also a minority position that says Iraq should have better relations with Iran at the cost of worsening ties with the US. But again, that's another minority on the other extreme. The majority political opinion, and I think this is shared, across the ethnic groups and sects from north to south, this is what drives government policy, which I believe their position is to maintain balanced relations. They understand Iran as a neighbor, and Iraq must have good relations with Iran. Iraq needs to have good relations with Syria, with Turkey, but also with the United States. The US is a superpower; it's invested in Iraq, and has contributed immensely to Iraq in the past, as well as also being at various times on conflicting sides. And so this position, I think, is what drives current government policy, previous government's policy, and I believe will be the future policy of the Iraqi government.
Right. Well, let's zoom out for a moment. What would you say are the main pillars of Iraq's foreign policy today, and especially in comparison with the pre 2003 regime and order? How have things changed between the pre 2003 era and post 2003 era?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the previous regime was a dictatorship and entered into wars that had huge consequences for the region. But before that phase, if we look at Iraq's foreign policy in the 70s, for example, in the 60s, and even going back further, Iraq wanted to have a position of leadership in the region. It certainly wanted to promote a form of Arab nationalism, I think. It's going back decades. The revolution in 1958, I think, militarized Iraq a little bit more than was healthy, and turned Iraq's military capability as a currency for some of its foreign policy influence. And the failed attempt to have a union with Syria and Egypt, for example, shows that the dangers of trying to internalize Arab nationalism with military capability, and I think that that led to obviously the rise of the Ba'ath. But post 2003, I think several Iraqi governments, as I was saying, have tried to promote neutrality. I think the idea is that Iraq is economically capable of being a big contributor to the region. And if it is able to engage these other countries that typically have avoided strong ties with Iraq, so the Gulf countries, for example, I would say even Jordan and Egypt, they've not really developed strong ties with Iraq. That has begun to change. And I think Iraq believes, the Iraqi government believes, that it is able to promote economic prosperity as a form of security for these other countries as well. That Iraq is not going to be a source of trouble, that Iraq is going to be a source of economic cooperation, and therefore it is worth building ties with Iraq. Of course, countries like Iran and Turkey have put a lot of effort into developing ties in Iraq and maintaining influence. Turkey has military forces and military bases inside Iraq. Iran has spent decades sponsoring parties and politicians and maintains a lot of influence inside Iraq. The US, I think, is the only other country that is invested in Iraq as much as Iran and Turkey. But I think it's now at the beginning where we're seeing some change. Some of these other countries are starting to develop ties with Iraq, and I think that's what Iraq's foreign policy is focused on: is how to increase the depth of relations with other countries in order to act as a balance to the influence of Iran and Turkey and the United States.
Recently, we had this major regional event taking place in Baghdad, the Arab League Summit. And the Iraqi government, tried to use that major diplomatic event to send a message to its neighbors about, the both the stability and the progress that Iraq had made, especially since the end of the conflict or the war against ISIS in 2018-19, and also to show that it's becoming again an important regional player. But one thing that really overshadowed the event, and I'm sure you have been following this closely, is the level of participation from other Arab countries. There were only a few countries that participated with their head of a state, such as Egypt, Qatar, even though the Qatari emir was in Baghdad only for a very brief time. So, what did this summit really tell us about Iraq's standing in the region? And by that I mean how Iraq is being perceived and received today in the neighborhood and the broader Middle East and North Africa region.
So I think the Arab League Summit was a limited success, let's say, or a qualified success. I mean, it's only the second time since 1990 that the summit was held in Baghdad. So that's part of why I would say it is a success. Obviously, the outcomes, the attendees, the engagement was more limited than what the Iraqi government hoped for. So that's why I say it's qualified. But I don't think the summit was ever designed to be a game changer in that sense. I think it reaffirms that Iraq is engaging with these other countries and that it has good relations. For example, the Emir of Qatar showed up and the president of Egypt and so on. There was high-level delegations as well. There was some good meetings before and after the summit. So that's positive. And it shows that, these other countries are willing to engage with Iraq and Iraq is ready. But of course, it's not to the level that Iraq aspires to. It wants more and it wants it quicker. How quick it gets there, I think this is the question. The Iraqi government is ambitious, as the previous one was, and the one before it. I think there was other factors as well. President Trump was in the region, literally in the same week as the Arab League Summit. There was an emergency meeting in Cairo in March, which was more decisive in terms of the agenda. So some things affected, how the summit went. But I think all in all, it's positive these events happen in Iraq, and I think it's good, it's healthy. But I don't think we expect the Arab League Summit to be a game changer as an event. I think it's part of building the portfolio and the profile of Iraqi diplomacy and engagement with other countries. And we wait to see the follow-up, So the development road, for example, it's a huge thing. It's a potential game changer, but we need to see the follow-up. We need to see progress on this. Likewise with, the other announcements that we've had on potential economic, ties with the GCC interconnection for electricity, the Basra Aqaba pipeline, for example. Once these actually begin to deliver, once we see them physically in action, I think that will lead to a major development in Iraq's relationships with other countries. Right now, it's cordial, it's pleasant, but there's not a lot of depth to it, and I think that's what we're waiting for.
And some of the observers attributed, the low level of participation on the part of the heads of states, kings, and presidents in the Arab world, to Iraq's position on Khor Abdullah, the area between Iraq and Kuwait, and the renewed territorial and border disputes between the two countries in the recent years, as well as Iraq's position towards Syria. And I'm sure you're aware of the efforts, especially on the part of the pro-Iranian camp inside Iraq against, the new Syrian president Ahmad al-Shara being invited to Baghdad, and the question of the existence of a judicial warrant for arresting him. Did all of this somehow, in your opinion, also play a role in the sense, that it renewed or revived this feeling, this sense among the Arab countries and the regional countries that Iraq was somehow being back to some sort of a troublemaker? Of course, nothing of the sort that Saddam Hussein did with Kuwait, with Iran, and the broader region. But do you feel like there was a sense of unhappiness and displeasure with some of Iraq's recent positions vis-a-vis Kuwait and Syria that made some of the Arab leaders not to be so willing and keen to take part in the Arab League summit in Iraq?
So I think for the countries that were a bit hesitant, I think they view Iraq as a work in progress. More needs to be done before they're willing to completely open their arms. And I think that's a reasonable position. And they've expressed this, in private to various officials, and obviously they've made their positions clear publicly as well. For example, Saudi leadership and those from the UAE and elsewhere. I think it's not a surprise that they're a bit hesitant to fully open their arms. Not because they view Iraq as a troublemaker, but I think they want to see more progress on issues like security. Is Iraq still a source of threat, even if it's not the government itself, even if it's armed groups within Iraq? Is it a source of threat to other countries? In the past, we've seen drones launched from Iraq that targeted other countries in the region. And so I think these countries are waiting for progress, something that they can point to say, well, Iraq has put in a lot of hard work, Iraq has changed, and therefore we need to, adapt our stance. That hasn't happened in their eyes, in the eyes of some of these countries. And therefore, so you weigh up the risks. What is the risk? I think Ahmed al-Shara not coming to Baghdad was a smart thing to do. He was invited, he was given security guarantees. I think he wanted to be there. But, I think it was wise of him to stay away because it would have maybe jeopardized the developing ties between Damascus and Baghdad. The relationship only began in late December. It hasn't been to the level that other countries have already had with Syria. And so I think it was wise for him not to attend. The foreign minister was there. And he did meet with Iraq's prime minister in Doha, before the summit. So every country, I think, has a different stance. Kuwait's position is that, Iraq's politicians, I wouldn't say the government, but Iraq's politicians have been negative and aggressive towards Kuwait. Syria's government, Ahmed al-Shara, has viewed potential threats against him as a reason to stay away. Mohammed bin Salman from Saudi Arabia is wanting to see more guarantees that Iraq's security will be maintained and not be a threat to the region. So every country has, different priorities and looking at Iraq from a different way. But I don't think it's more a collective view of negativity towards Iraq. I think it's more individual circumstances. So, the Arab League summit, as I said, was not a game changer. I wouldn't have expected it to be. But I think that a lot of countries are waiting to see more from Iraq before they increase their engagement.
I think you would agree with me if I said that, the October 7th, 2023 attack by Hamas on southern Israel and the, subsequent chain of events from the conflict in Gaza, which is ongoing, the downgrading of the Lebanese Hezbollah, of Hamas itself in the Gaza Strip, the collapse of the Assad regime. which was in some way tied to those broader sort of events ongoing in the region and the broader decline of the pro-Iran axis. That these chain of events have been probably the most consequential developments that we have seen in the region, maybe in a couple of decades, at least since the collapse of the Saddam regime in 2003. How have these developments since October 2023 affected Iraq's position in the region and its space for maneuvering and establishing itself as an important regional actor, which was kind of the trajectory really up until that moment in October 2023. The last few administrations in Iraq had been really focused on bringing Iraq back into the fold regionally, buying Iraq some respect as an important region, as an important actor, an actor that could mediate between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for example. How have these developments since October 2023 shaped Iraq's position and space and ability to maneuver?
So I think it reinforced to the Iraqi government, it reinforced the importance of having broadly good ties with countries in the region and beyond, and avoiding falling into a side or a camp. I think that the fact that the Iraqi government has built up ties with the new regime in Syria is a signal of that, is that they think this is the right policy and it is working and it is valuable, and avoid falling into an axis or a side. So yes, events in 2023 and 2024 maybe surprised some officials in Iraq, and the pace of some of these changes. But also, I think it reinforced that you cannot expect the region to be unchanged for decades, to stay the way it was in 2003 or before that. The change is always around the corner, essentially, particularly with the number of authoritarian regimes that we have, with the struggling economies that we have, but also with the change in global politics. The U.S. administration is changing things up. Alliances are being built and others are crumbling. And so I think the Iraqi government needs to adapt to these changes and to understand that, it cannot maintain a stance built over 10, 15 years and ignore changes on the ground. So the Syrian regime collapsing, the previous Syrian regime collapsing, I think should not have been a surprise to the government in Baghdad. They should have seen this coming, and they should have taken steps many years before to avoid becoming too close to Damascus at the time, to make sure Iraqi groups do not enter Syria as well to engage in the conflict. Unfortunately, they did not. The previous governments failed to really push for that, and it's no surprise that some countries then, after regime change in Syria, viewed Iraq in a sort of negative light. But I think it also reinforces to other countries, like to Iran, how important Iraq is, and for it to maintain its influence, and for countries like the US, how important Iraq is, and the need to maintain a presence in Iraq and good relations with Iraq, because Iraq is consequential. It is a country of tremendous resources, but also impact. And so I think this position of Iraq is still undecided in a way. There is still going to be a fight for influence between Iran, Turkey, the US, and other countries.
And what about the relationship between Baghdad or the federal government in Baghdad and the Kurdistan region? Do you see, that the different attitudes toward some of the neighboring countries, the difference between how Baghdad sees and views some of the neighboring countries and what kind of relations it should have with them, and how Erbil or the Kurdistan region in general does? Do you think that difference also affects how Iraq is, being seen externally, like from the point of view of other regional actors? And in what ways does that affect Iraq's strength and position in the region?
Yeah, I mean, that comes back to the earlier point. I don't think Iraq has a united foreign policy, as I said, because internally there's so many players. So, even in Baghdad, there are people who are heavily pro-US or heavily pro-Iran or much more neutral or very much pro-Turkey and or now pro-Syria or anti-Syria. So it makes it very difficult when you have so many different stances for one sort of position to emerge. And this internal competition, I think, is detrimental personally. I think it's much healthier if, the federal government in Baghdad, the regional government in Kurdistan had a much more tight foreign policy, much more agreement between them. I think it's healthier for both. But also, even within Kurdistan, I think there's a difference in positions between Erbil and Suleimaniya. And I think that's also a concern that even at the sort of local level, even within Baghdad or even within Kurdistan, there is a tremendous difference in opinion. And I think that's something that other countries play to their advantage, countries like Turkey and Iran and the US, knowing that the different players have different positions, they can then build their influence through them. And I think that's unfortunate, to be honest with you.
And let's try to focus more specifically on Iraq's relationship with some of the neighboring countries, and let's start from Syria, where the major, change happened in December last year with the Assad regime falling and a new government or regime basically taking its place ever since. Of course, Iraq has had a troubled relationship with Syria for quite a long time. If you go back, to the history, right from the very moment of Syria's independence, Iraq's support for a number of coups in that country, Iraq's tumultuous relationship with Syria under, the Ba'ath Party in Baghdad and the Ba'ath Party in Damascus. And then after 2003, we had the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad being basically part of the, efforts to undermine the new post-Saddam Iraq. And then after 2011, Iraq, both at the level of the government, but especially, non-state armed factions, the pro-Iran militias, getting seriously involved in the civil war and the proxy war in that country, in Syria. Based on all of this and what we have seen so far in Baghdad since December last year, how do you assess Iraq's approach to post-Assad Syria so far? We have seen a lot of hesitation. How do you think Iraq is going to deal with all of this in the coming month and year?
So I'm optimistic. I think the fact that both countries have been sort of cautiously moving relations along is positive, and I think that's the right track. Going too far too quickly, I think, is going to lead, obviously, to backlash from anti-Syria politicians inside Iraq. But also, I think at the moment the relationship does not have much substance to it. The Syrian government is an interim government. There are a lot of outstanding issues with regards to the border, internal security, concerns about communal and sectarian violence. We need to look at the economic relationship as well with Syria. We've had issues in the past with narcotics, with smuggling. So there is a lot of work to be done, but I think we're on the right track. And I think the pace that the relationship is developing at is not bad. I think it's positive from my point of view. And I expect it to develop further in the next 12, 18 months. I think the Iraqi government has done the right thing so far. I don't think it's made any mistakes in that relationship. It's it sent senior officials to Damascus. It's received the Syrian foreign minister a couple of times already. I think the diplomatic relationship is increasing between the two countries. But I would like to see some more substance develop over the next year or so. What is our relationship with Syria going to look like? I mean, so Jordan benefits a lot from Iraq, and we maintain good relations with the Jordanian government. But with Syria, and we could say the same thing about Iran, and same thing with Turkey, for example. Well, with Syria, there's still a bit of unknown. What is it going to look like? Even under the Assad regime, the relationship with Syria was, was questionable. Economically, it was questionable. Security-wise, it was questionable. As you said, pre-2011, the relationship was actually very negative. So I think there is just, as you said, a history of with Syria that the relationship is not clear, and I think it's the right time now to try to clarify that. What is it that we want from Syria? What does Syria want from us? What can we provide to each other? And I think we're on the right path, if I'm honest with you.
And what do you think each of these two countries should do in terms of steps, and measures to build confidence and make this relationship move forward in a constructive and positive manner? What kind of specific steps could be taken?
Yeah, so I think from the Syrian perspective, I think obviously the more they can continue to maintain security, maintain stability, provide security to the various ethnic and sectarian groups inside Syria, encourage tourism and religious pilgrimage to the sites in Syria, offer protection to people that do visit. I think that will reinforce to people that the Syrian government is not the government that emerged from Al Qaeda, for example. No, this is something different, and they should be given a chance. So that's a measure, one single measure that the Syrian government can undertake. From the Iraqi perspective, I think they need to realize how economically desperate the Syrian people are. They're in a difficult position, and Iraq should be able to provide some sort of economic support. Whether it's discounted oil or fuel or foodstuffs, or opening up the border for trade. This kind of measures, I think, would increase goodwill between the two. And certainly, I think all the countries in the region would welcome it. And I think the Syrian government is ready for this. And even though there is critical voices of Syria inside Iraq, I think by and large, the populations would be happy to see both countries increasing their relations.
Let's move to Iraq's relationship with Turkey. Clearly, not a very easy relationship, both historically and also, over the past couple of decades or so. We have seen some developments, such as the development road project that has become a major area of focus and cooperation between both Baghdad and Ankara. And we have also seen the efforts towards some sort of peace between the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, and Turkey, which will have some sort of, bearing on Iraq for sure, given that the PKK has been based in Iraq for decades. Do you think that the relationship between Iraq and Turkey is moving towards some sort of a strategic reset, where things would be more mutually beneficial for both sides? Or do you think, in light of Turkey's ascendance, especially since the fall of the Assad regime and the new confidence that Ankara has gained, that that Ankara would be less of a sort of a partner that Iraq would wish for, and perhaps would continue to exert leverage over Iraq in ways that Iraq would not be happy about?
I mean, I don't think the relationship needs a reset. I think it's a good relationship between the federal government and the Turkish government. I think the issue is we're waiting for outcomes from other dialogues. As you mentioned, the PKK and the Turkish government and the SDF and the Syrian government. If there is a resolution, if there is a follow through and resolution to these, if we have positive outcomes, then I think naturally the Turkish government will be less wary of Iraq as a source of a security threat. May be willing to reduce its military footprint in Iraq and certainly reduce its military activity. That will be very positive for everybody inside Iraq and lead to more trust between the two sides. Right now, we're not there because we're waiting to see, is there going to be follow through? Will the PKK reduce its activities inside Iraq? And the SDF, is it going to have a place in the government in Damascus? Will we see less Turkish aggression in Syria and Iraq? these are what we're waiting for. Once we have clarity, I think then the relationship will, either move forward in a positive way or regress, and there'll be more trouble in the future. Obviously, I'm positive and hopeful, and the signals so far are positive. But without resolution to these issues, I think the Turks are not going to change their stance. They're going to be very cautious and wary of Iraq. They're going to maintain their military footprint. They're going to maintain their aggressive stance, with conducting assassinations and airstrikes. And I think they will wait to see, what develops from these other situations, but also Iraqi government attitude towards PKK and pro-PKK groups inside Iraq. So unfortunately, we don't have resolution on that. But if we do, I think it will be tremendously beneficial for both countries. Development road is one aspect. We have discussions on water rights, on water sharing, but Turkey is an economic giant in the region, and I think Iraq has a lot to offer to Turkey, in addition to the development road. So there is a lot to gain for both countries, but unfortunately, Iraq is in this position where it's waiting to see what happens, and we don't know how long this could last.
Let me remind our audiences that they can send in their questions either as replies to this space, to this post, or they can wait and request the mic in the last 10 minutes of this episode, which should be in 7 or 8 minutes. So let's move to Iran. Iran and Iraq have had, a history of uneasy relations, of hostile relations, at least, since the 60s and 70s under the Shah, over territorial disputes in Shat al-Arab area, and later, of course, in the 80s. The 8-year war between the two countries as a result of Iraq's invasion of Iran under Saddam Hussein's regime. And of course, for the past 20 years or so, since 2003, Iran has been one of the two major, dominant and influential foreign states or players inside Iraq, alongside the US, and at times some people might argue that Iran has had more influence in shaping the course of events inside Iraq. But with the apparent decline of the Iran-led regional axis since October 2023, do you see Iraq having a chance of, or actually doing, some sort of repositioning of its relationship with Tehran? Are we seeing some sort of a shift from an alignment, to put it that way, toward more of a transactional or equal engagement between these two countries?
I think that's an ongoing effort. I think, with the exception of the Adil Abdel Mahdi period, I think the previous governments, from Haider al-Abadi, Mustafa Kadhimi, now Mohammed Shah Sudani, I think they have all tried to, maintain balanced relations and explain to the Iranians the importance of Iraq maintaining its sovereignty and independence from, excessive Iranian influence. I think they've all tried to push back against this excessive influence at various times, particularly with regards to Iran's sponsorship of, armed actors inside Iraq. I think that's been troubling Baghdad for many years, and they've tried to push Iran to rein in some of those actors and limit their support to them. And I think this will continue. This is happening now, and this will happen, in the future as well. Iran is tricky because, it's very rare that you can say Iran and mean a single player, because most of the, post 2003 relationship with Iran has been dominated by the fact that Iran has had three different foreign policy leaders, so to say. The IRGC in one, the supreme leader, and then the Iranian government. And most of these years, these last 20 plus years, these three sides have not been on the same page. The IRGC has one view and action towards Iraq, the supreme leader has a different view, and the Iranian government has an alternative view. And that's been problematic for Iraq, to try to engage all three of them on an equal footing and to make sure they all sort of have the same position towards Iraq. That hasn't really happened. For a brief period, last couple of years, there was a window where we could see the emergence of a unified position from Iran, the IRGC and the president and the Supreme Leader. But again, that's changed now with the election of Pezeshkian as president. So it's tricky for Iraq's politicians also to engage Iran. But I think Iran is also still trying to configure its policy towards the region as a whole. It had definitely had a setback the last 2 years, and it's trying to reassess. It's trying to reconfigure. Is it going to enter into a deal with the United States? Will that lead to the need to rein in some of the IRGC activities in the region? Will the IRGC, toe the line? Will they listen and follow the outcome of any such deal? This is a question. From the Iraqi government's perspective, I think, they understand that Iran will always be here. It will always be Iraq's neighbor. It's not going away. It doesn't matter who's in government in Tehran. As you said, even under the Shah's regime, we had difficult relations. So that's not going to change anytime soon. But I think they are trying to push for the fact that a prosperous Iraq that is has good relations with the US and Iran, is not a security threat to anybody, is the ideal outcome for Iran and for other countries. And that's what they want to emphasize.
I think this is a good transition to my next question that, brings Iran, Iraq, and the United States all together. And, the gas deals that were recently signed by the Kurdistan Regional Government, the KRG, with U.S. energy firms in Washington, that has, sparked quite some uproar and opposition in Baghdad. One way that both the KRG and U.S. in particular have tried to frame the benefit of those deals is for Iraq to achieve energy self-sufficiency, which even without mentioning Iran, by implication means that Iraq will be less dependent on Iranian gas imports and electricity imports. We today also had the U.S. State Department again reiterate its support for those energy deals between the KRG and American companies. In what way do you think these deals are going to shape, the relationship between Iraq, between Iran, and between the U.S., also keeping the KRG in mind as an actor moving forward from here?
So, two things to point out right away. The first is it's very clear what the administration in Washington wants. It wants to understand the benefit it receives for engaging with other countries. It's very transactional in that sense. And some countries have understood this and they've pushed ahead, countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, and made these giant deals to invest in the United States because that's what President Trump wants. He wants to see value. Why am I engaging with you? What is the value you're offering for America? And I think in that sense, it's no surprise that we have deals being announced around energy. I think that's certainly what the US wants as a cost for continuing to maintain good ties. So that's, I think, a fact on the ground that's been established now. The second is that Iran has not been a reliable export partner for Iraq for gas or electricity. It has struggled to maintain gas exports to Iraq. And I think electricity imports have stopped and have been stopped for over 6 months now because Iran has a deficit at home. So these two things, I think, are aligned. They're not. It's not a zero sum in that respect because Iran is not able to provide the energy that Iraq needs. It provides some, or has provided some in the past, but for the future, I don't think Iran is able to maintain any sorts of exports, either gas or electricity, because of the challenges it faces at home. And so, Iraq or the Kurdistan region, they will have to increase their resources in terms of energy, whether it's fuel or electricity, and avoid having to rely on imports. Iraq is a giant in terms of petroleum reserves and exports, and yet we still have to import refined fuels, for example. It makes no sense. Likewise, with electricity, billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars have been spent on electricity generation and distribution and so on, and yet we still have blackouts. It makes no sense. And so buying electricity, I don't think is ideal. We have the resources to generate enough electricity. We certainly can capture gas, and we have also lots of oil, and that I think is the secret to why Iraq needs more of these types of deals. Now, of course, you're going to have the question of the oil ministry, federal oil ministry in Baghdad, and then the deals that are being struck by the KRG, but also then questions being put forward from the PUK to say, most of these deals are struck by Erbil without much benefit directly for cities. So there's lots of other elements to this, but putting that aside, I think it's common sense to expect that Iraq cannot rely on Iran for energy imports for the future.
I think, Sajad, in terms of that Erbil and Soleimani or PUK and KDP dynamic and rivalry element, the way that I understand it is that the PUK is, for the most part, on board with these gas deals, given that the gas fields that have been, basically the focus of these contracts are located in the PUK controlled region of Kurdistan.
Correct.
And without their approval, this would not have probably happened. But let's explain this. Let us have you explain this, of course, to our audiences. Why is Baghdad then opposed to this? Is this like mostly due to the question of sovereignty and some sort of concern that the KRG would use these agreements to cement its relationship with Washington in a way that Baghdad would see as detrimental to its authority and sovereignty over the country? Or what other factors are there?
I mean, so it's economic and political. On the economic side, most of the politicians in Baghdad have been raised on the culture of centralization, the fact that decisions need to be made in Baghdad, deals need to be struck with Baghdad, money needs to flow in and out of Baghdad. That's just going back decades. I don't think that attitude is going to change anytime soon. Federalism is not being implemented properly in Iraq. I think that's a fact. And therefore, while you have these legal challenges, while Baghdad has not come to an agreement with Erbil on how to manage oil exports, there's still no agreement there. There are temporary deals just to facilitate some flows in order to guarantee, salary payments and so on. But there was no real deal. We have to have that deal. Until that time, I think we will continue to have these disputes, regularly, because Erbil insists that it has the power and constitutional right to sign deals to export oil. It doesn't need Baghdad's approval, and Baghdad obviously insists the opposite. So that, I think, is going to need a political agreement internally. I don't think it's something that can be decided in the courts. It will need a bona fide political agreement between Baghdad and Erbil, which should have been done 20 years ago. Unfortunately, it has not. So that's on the economic side. On the political side, I think, sure. I mean, the fact that Kurdistan regional government has engaged heavily with the U.S. administration the last few months, while Baghdad is seemingly fall behind. I think, of course, that is a point of concern to the Iraqi government. But that it shouldn't be a surprise, because the Iraqi government itself, as I said, is not really engaged, because their foreign policy is slow. Erbil is one party. Even if at times the PUK disagrees on certain issues, I think they both, the KDP and PUK, understand the importance of having good ties with the US, and both very pro-US and maintain good ties with the US. And there is no conflict on that side of the equation. Whereas in Baghdad, the different players have different views, and that's why the foreign policy is slow and complicated and fragmented in Baghdad, whereas in Erbil it's smooth and much quicker. So that sense of competition, I don't think will go away. But the US understands that it can maintain more influence over the Kurdistan region, and so therefore it's willing to invest more into that relationship right now. But is that sustainable? Is that the right approach? Turkey does the same thing, and I think Iran does the same thing in Baghdad. They choose players to maintain better ties with and influence and expect more in return. As I said, I don't think this is healthy for Iraq as a whole. I think it's much better for Iraq to have a more unified position. Unfortunately, just because of the nature of post-2003 regime change, this looks like the split in how each player allies themselves with a foreign country will continue for the near future.
I think for any observer of U.S. foreign policy under the current administration of President Donald Trump, and also his first administration between 2017 to 2021, a couple of major pillars of American foreign policy appears to be a commerce oriented and driven foreign policy, and also a non-interventionist policy. Do you think going forward from here, this kind of attitude or foreign policy priorities by the US government, how is it going to affect Washington's relationship with Baghdad and Erbil? And which one of these two parties are these sort of key pillars of the new U.S. foreign policy going to, advantage more?
Yeah, it's whoever can offer the most value to the United States in terms of economic benefit. I think the President Trump has been very clear on this. What value do these countries hold? What do they provide for the U.S.? Why should the U.S. be invested there or engage with them? Why should the U.S. provide, for example, in the case of Ukraine, why should we send weapons to Ukraine? What is the purpose of this? What is the purpose of prolonging the conflict with Russia? So that's been articulated very clearly, that the U.S. is looking for direct benefits in this relationship, because the Trump administration believes, and supporters of President Trump believe, the U.S. has been taken advantage of over the years, and so they're trying to rebalance the relationship. So from Iraq's perspective, whether it's Baghdad or the Kurdistan region, is what can they show Washington in terms of what they can offer? Saudi, for example, President Trump's trips to Saudi, Qatar, and UAE was all about announcing deals, worth tens or hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in the US in order to show benefit to maintaining good ties with Washington and these countries. Obviously, Iraq is not at that level, not prepared yet to invest in the US or even to open up the country for investment. And even the size of the deals, announced with regards to the gas and the KRG, some of these are just a continuation of previous deals. We've not seen much new, which I think is what is being expected. I think that's what Washington wants. What is it you can offer us that is going to make us develop our ties with you? What, apart from being, or trying to lobby for security purposes and so on, economically, what can you offer us? And I think that question is being put forward to Europe. It's being put forward to Asia. It's been put forward to South America, and even to countries that neighbor the US, like Canada and Mexico. What are we gaining out of this relationship? I think that's a fairly logical question. A lot of people in the United States are concerned about how much money the US puts into other countries and benefits other countries, and then in return, the US has issues with immigration, with narcotics abuse, and a country like Iraq, that the US has put in probably trillions of dollars over the years. And they asked the question, why did we get involved in Iraq? What is the benefit? Why do we still spend money in Iraq for Iraq's benefit? What is it that we get out of this? And I think that's what players inside Iraq need to focus on. What are they, if they want to maintain good ties with the US, what can they offer the United States?
Just a note to our audience that if you want to ask any questions, you can raise your hands here virtually, of course, and request the mic in the remaining 5, 6, 7 minutes that we have. Before we get any questions, Sajad, let me ask you this question. To a lot of people observing the region, it appears, that we have a new alignment in the region, some sort of a new regional order emerging with, key U.S. allies such as Israel, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia being the, main pillars of a new alignment of this new order in the region. If we accept that, if we concede that this is actually happening, how do you see Baghdad benefiting or being negatively affected by this new emerging alignment?
I don't know. I wouldn't say Iraq is worried about the emergence of a new order in the Middle East. I'm not sure there is the emergence of a new order in the Middle East. I think America wants to see the United States is pushing actively for more integration for Israel with other countries. I think that's a position they've held for decades, and this administration will push more for. But I think more consequential for Iraq, if I'm honest with you, is the outcome of US-Iran dialogue. I think that's the most important thing. If the US and Iran reach an agreement, I think that's very positive for Iraq. We'll see more stability. We'll see better ties with other countries. We'll see a direct benefit for Iraq. But if the talks break down, if there's no positive outcomes, or if the talks end and hostilities increase between Iran and the US, that directly leads to instability for Iraq. I think we'll see, more trouble for Iraq very quickly if that happens. So that is where I would probably look to for the future: is can we get a better relationship between Iran and US, and will that hold? If so, I think that will lead to a tremendous gain for Iraq. The opposite of that, or the converse of that, is if the relationship breaks down, I think those two countries will fight it out in Iraq, and that means the rest of the region will also be looking at Iraq as an arena for settling scores, for fighting for influence, for trying to push back against Iran or the US and so on. So, unfortunately, we're in that position where we're waiting to see what happens there.
Do you believe that if this nuclear deal between Tehran and Washington actually happen, would that mean more tolerance than on the part of the West and some of the other regional actors and states for Iranian influence in Iraq? Or, I mean, I sometimes get the sense that even if the US is going to be somehow fine with that, because, the Middle East is not America's top priority, they are more focused on the Indo-Pacific region now, and to a lesser extent on Eastern Europe. But it seems to me that a deal between Iran and America might not necessarily translate into more stability and sort of a better regional position, stronger regional position for Iraq, especially given the concern that some of the other regional actors, in particular Israel and to some extent Turkey, might have in terms of the Iranian regional allies and network in the region, with Iraq being sort of a core pillar or element of that network. What are your thoughts on that?
I would be a bit more optimistic. Look at the improvement in relations with between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Once they had that reset, I don't think the IRGC was actively trying to pose a threat to Saudi, and the opposite. I think they were in agreement that this is a new chapter in the relations, and therefore they should encourage the Saudis that the relationship will develop, and that Iran will not threaten Saudi, directly or indirectly, security-wise. And I think that relationship has held and is developing still. And so, even if it's not written in paper, even if it's not a hard guarantee that any deal between Iran and the US will lead to improved stability in the Middle East, because Iran will not seek to promote pro-Iran groups' activity in the Middle East, I think naturally that will happen, because Iran will not want to endanger any deal. It will want to maintain a deal that it has if it ever gets signed with the US. And I think other countries will also see it as a condition, to integrate Iran more into the region and develop their ties, is to say, well, politically or on the ground, security-wise, what are you doing? If you're saying one thing with regards to nuclear energy, but on the ground you're doing something else, then nothing has changed. That's just a temporary agreement that you have with the US that can be torn up, as has in the past. So I think that's probably where Iran wants to reach it. It wants to have an agreement with the US as a precursor to having better ties with other countries in the region. And perhaps we could see, more integration economically between all these countries. But right now we're in need of confidence building measures. And I think that's the reason why these last few months, we've not seen, for example, attacks launched from inside Iraq against American forces or against other countries. And I think that part of that is because Iran is wanting to, enter into a serious discussion with the United States. So I would be a little bit more optimistic on that.
Since we haven't had any questions from our audiences, I'm going to ask one final question here and we'll wrap it up after this. So, we have parliamentary elections set for November this year, 2025, in Iraq. What kind of change do you think those elections, the outcome of those elections, might bring to Iraq's, relations with neighboring countries and with other important countries such as the U.S. Um, should we expect any sort of change really happening? Very briefly.
I don't think so. I think, as I said, the successive Iraqi governments have tried to promote, this idea of maintaining neutrality and having balanced foreign relations. I don't think that's going to change, regardless of what happens with the elections. I think Baghdad has to have, Iraq as a whole, has to have good relations with Iran and Turkey and the US. I don't think that's going to change. So, even though we may see a change in personnel, a new foreign minister, a new prime minister, and so on, I think the policy is going to force Iraq to maintain its current position. We do not have the leverage or the means or the power to, force other countries to change their ties with us. And so, therefore, we have to have this consensus position amongst our players that we need to have good ties across the board. We cannot afford to choose sides. I don't think that's going to change after the elections.
And even if the pro-Iran groups in Iraq are going to perform, let's say, not as well as they did the last time, even though they didn't perform that well, but after the withdrawal of the Sadrist movement from the parliament, they came to dominate the government. If they're not going to perform as well this time, do you think that will still have any sort of impact on Iraq's foreign policy direction and relations with other regional and international actors?
No, not anything major. That's what I mean. I think this current position is probably what's going to be maintained. I don't think we'll see a sudden shift either to one side or the other, just because the number of players that we have, it doesn't matter how many seats in parliament. There's some power on the ground that cannot be erased by elections. People, the players will have their power, and regardless of what happens in the elections. So I think this current position will be maintained. You can always see small adjustments. I think that happened under Adil Abdulmehdi and then changed again under Mustafa al-Kadhimi. You can see some adjustments in positions, certainly. As, for example, from Noor al-Maliki government to Haider al-Abadi's government, there was an adjustment there. So adjustments can happen, but I don't think there'll be a tremendous change, regardless of the outcome of the elections.
Right. That's very well said. That's it for today. Thank you so much, Sajad, for your insights and for helping us make sense of a very complex topic. Just a reminder to our audience that after this live session, this episode will be repackaged as a podcast and published on the New Regions website under the Watch section and on the New Regions YouTube channel and SoundCloud channel by tomorrow's end. And thank you to our audiences as well for being with us today. And see you in 2 weeks for the next episode of GeoSpace.